It took just 6 weeks for the US-built humanitarian pier to fail. On May 15th, US Navy ships sailed from the Israeli port of Ashdod to Gaza, as these exclusive Al Jazeera images show. These are warships and logistics vessels responsible for connecting the floating structure to Gaza's shore, on a causeway in the Sheikh Ajleen area. The pier became operational on May 17th, supported by 2 ships sitting about 9 kilometers off the coast. The images show 2 US ships and a smaller one intended to transport trucks onto the pier. But problems arose almost immediately. 8 days later, high waves overwhelmed the pier. Over that period, just 29 trucks delivered 99 shipments into Gaza.
Dilemma that the American forces had in trying to build a pier with absolutely zero support from the Israelis in a place of war, and trying to bypass the Israelis without coming to a clash with them. And it added up to too little with bad weather too late.
Publicly available logistics details show US Navy personnel constructing the pier. US officials said the mission was also to protect it, armed with machine guns and armored vehicles. US forces also installed an air defense system and attached it to the eastern side of the pier. When the pier collapsed, they had to dismantle the system as well. The Falk's missile defense system is capable of automatically tracking missiles and aircraft. US military officials are now looking at what went wrong with the project.
In the meantime, more than 2 million Palestinians continue to suffer with not nearly enough aid getting into Gaza by land, air or sea. Tareq, Azzoum, Al Jazeera, Deir al-Balah, Palestine.
Well, let's bring in Gershon Baskin. He's the Middle East director at the NGO, the International Communities Organization. He's also a former hostage negotiator. He joins us now from West Jerusalem. Gershon, there were always questions about how this pier would function, criticism too that it was a distraction and an excuse not to open land routes. Does this failure of the pier now change the diplomatic calculus here? Is there perhaps more pressure on the Israelis to reopen land borders?
I think there is international pressure on Israel to open up additional land borders. The Rafah crossing is closed since Israel conquered the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing, which has cut down a major passageway for aid. There is the Kerem Shalom passageway from the Israeli side into Gaza that needs to be open, and there needs to be routes from the north of Gaza into the northern part of Gaza, into Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia, Jabalia, Gaza City. This all needs to be done, and it has to be as a result of international pressure, because it's doubtful that Israel will do it on its own.
You say international pressure. I've been wondering, as we watch the humanitarian situation deteriorate even further, we see more and more pictures of emaciated, dying children, more and more civilian deaths. Where is public sentiment in Israel? I mean, we've seen people actually attacking aid trucks.
Right. Public sentiment in Israel is mainly with the Israeli hostages and the families of the hostages and the families of soldiers who have been killed. There's a really one-sided view of the war from the Israeli side. The Israelis don't really see the humanitarian suffering in Gaza. I think it's perhaps time that we understand also that the problem is not only getting the trucks in, but there's also a problem of distribution, because there's a breakdown of law and order. In Gaza, there is no functioning police, and if there was a police, it would be Hamas police. Maybe it's time for the United Nations Security Council not only to pass resolutions for calling for a ceasefire, but perhaps to use Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter and to send international forces to protect the Palestinian people in Gaza, to force the Israelis to withdraw and to put an end to this war.
That's a big call, Gershon. So you're saying that you're for international intervention, for arms and boots on the ground from other countries?
Well, I don't know how we're going to end this war, because the Israelis have refused to deal with any alternative to Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is digging in its boots into the ground and putting out statements, a big statement by Khaled Mashal just yesterday about Hamas staying in Gaza and that no one would replace them. So we need to look toward the future where Gaza will be able to be governed, where reconstruction can happen. The international community isn't going to put a penny into Gaza as long as Hamas is in control or as long as Israel is in Gaza. So we need to think out of the box and come up with solutions that will enable this war to end, the Israeli hostages to come home, and a rebuilding of Gaza process to begin in collaboration with Palestinians on the ground and Palestinians in the West Bank. It needs to be done collaboratively, but we need to get this war to end quickly.
You speak about the war ending, but you mentioned that public sentiment in Israel remains very much with the captives. There's obviously been huge and growing anger about the Israeli government's lack of ability to get them home. Is that now also perhaps shifting to the way that the war is actually being carried out? We have been seeing more and more divisions in government.
Well, we are seeing divisions in the government, not necessarily about the war in Gaza or about the hostages. It's mainly internal Israeli issues like the draft law, the Supreme Court decision of 2 days ago, which is obligating the government to draft all the ultra-Orthodox into the army until there's a law that gives them some kind of deferment from the army, which is unlikely to happen at this time. So the government of Israel seems to be imploding, which is a good thing. We need to get to new elections, but even that's a process that will take months, not days.
Well, let me ask you then, right now, where are any kind of talks around captive exchanges, a ceasefire? You yourself dealt with Hamas as a hostage negotiator for 17 years. What would it take right now to get momentum going again?
I really don't know. We have an unbridgeable gap, it seems, at the present time where Hamas is not going to make any agreement with Israel that does not include an end to the war. And Mr. Netanyahu has made it quite clear that he is only willing to do a partial agreement without an obligation to end the war. I've spoken to people on the Israeli negotiating team who have told me that this is the reality on the ground, that Netanyahu has not given a green light to the negotiators to arrive at an agreement that would end the war. Netanyahu is sticking to what he says only a partial agreement that would bring some of the hostages home and give us a ceasefire, but not an obligation to end the war. So we are stuck. And the families of the hostages are extremely frustrated and sad. We're 9 months into this war now and no end in sight.
Gershon Baskin, they're the Middle East director at the NGO, the International Communities Organization. Thank you for joining us again on Al Jazeera. It's great to get your thoughts.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.